The moment Chloe clacked through the glass doors, I knew the weather inside had changed. Not just because of the way her stiletto stabbed the tile like they had a personal vendetta against Grout. Not just because her little entourage, all manicured men with matching leather messenger bags, stood around her like backup dancers in a failed television startup show. No, I knew it, when she spotted me knitting in the corner of the bullpen and said with a performative little gasp, "Oh, you can take your knitting home. We're building the future here." The room went dead silent. I could hear the hum of the servers down the hall and the carbonation fizzing in someone's soda. I did not even look up, just slid the final stitch off the needle, clipped the yarn, and tucked the half-finished sock into my tote bag like I had been waiting for this exact moment. Because see, this was not the first time I had been underestimated by a child of privilege, but this was the first time that child came with a sweet title and authority over my database. Chloe Montgomery, newly minted Chief Technology Officer by virtue of bloodline and burn rate, had arrived to modernize operations. That is corporate speak for kicking out the grown-ups and replacing them with people who say synergy without irony. My name is Gavin Vance, and I was 54 years old. For the past 8 years, I had served as the lead systems architect at Apex Platform, watching it grow from a fragile idea into a robust entity. I had worked my way up from a small consultant desk, and I had never forgotten what it felt like to build something out of nothing. That foundation kept me grounded, kept me connected to every single server rack, database query, and line of code that kept our business alive. I had seen the company survive early funding scares, minor platform crashes, and the chaotic expansion that followed our initial success. The original founder, Ronald Montgomery, who also happened to be Chloe's father, had built the firm on relationships and hard work, but as he stepped back to let his daughter take the reins, the culture shifted overnight from engineering discipline to marketing hype. Ronald was a man of the old school, someone who understood that you do not scale a company by buying more office chairs or purchasing custom espresso machines. He knew that a stable database backend was the foundation of everything. When he handed the control to Chloe, he did so with the hope that she would maintain that same respect for the engineering foundation. But Chloe was more interested in social media presence and investor presentations. That afternoon, Chloe called for an all-hands reorientation. She sat cross-legged on a high stool in the conference room like a motivational speaker who sells bootstraps to orphans. She talked about velocity, vision, and disrupting legacy workflows, all while pointedly not looking at me. Even when she got to the part about sunsetting outdated personnel structures, her eyes skipped over me like I was an empty chair. But her assistant, a junior developer named Liam Foster, handed out organizational charts with a little red arrow next to my name labeled Transition Resource. I have had kidney stones that were delivered with more grace. The junior developers in the room avoided making eye contact with me. They knew what that arrow meant. It was the corporate kiss of death, wrapped in a friendly pastel color scheme. They were young, eager to please the new leadership, and entirely unaware of how much of their daily coding relied on the silent architecture I had spent years tuning. That night, I stayed late, not because I needed to, but because I wanted them to see me do it. I moved my knitting bag off the desk, set up my backup drive, and opened the encrypted local vault containing the database modules for Vance Intellectual Property, Stack version 4.2. That folder held 4 patents, 8 custom modules, and the backbone of the entire platform they thought they were reimagining. All built during my years as an independent consultant, all licensed to the company under revocable terms. My terms, my holding company, Vance Intellectual Property Holdings, and my signatures. They had gotten so used to me sitting quietly with my needles and my peppermint tea that they forgot. I also held the blueprints. I backed everything up. Triple copies. One on the physical drive, one on cold storage, one on an offshore server in Reykjavik that I had set up after the first red flag back in the second quarter when they started cutting the quality assurance budget and doubling advertising spend. That is not disruption. That is what I call failing to check your parachute. The next morning, my physical access card did not work on the main server room. That was when I knew I was officially a ghost in the machine, And that was when I started smiling, because when a ghost has receipts, he does not haunt the hallways. He sends invoices to the board of directors. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and pulled out my yarn. If they wanted a ghost, I would show them how quietly a ghost could sit. I cast on 32 stitches, with a deep indigo merino wool yarn, letting my fingers memorize the rhythm of the needles, while my mind cataloged every dependency they were about to break. The office buzzed around me, oblivious to the fact that the entire digital foundation of their startup was resting on a fragile thread of licensing agreements that they had just decided to cut. They called it a strategic restructure, which is rich coming from a woman who once asked if Python was the one with the coffee logo. Overnight, my job title morphed from lead systems architect to principal legacy consultant emeritus, which in corporate taxonomy is code for keep him around so he does not sue, but do not let him near anything that plugs in. I lost access to the build queue, the private online messaging channel I started 6 years ago with 3 developers, and a pizza budget was archived. The last time I opened the project tracker, the dashboard simply read, "No tasks assigned." A new product manager, someone with a double-barreled last name and a resume full of design philosophy, sent me a cheerful direct message. "Just hang tight while we realign responsibilities." Then he added a winky face. I had not felt that patronized since my ex-wife explained how a thermostat works. My calendar evaporated. No stand-ups, no one-on-ones, no sprint planning. I became the office ghost floating between desks, nodded at but never addressed directly. I could have dyed my hair blue, roller skated through the hallway, and Chloe still would not have noticed. I was background noise, but here is the thing about being background noise. You hear everything. Chloe strutted around the office, tossing jargon like confetti, talking about scalability, containerization, and value unlocks, while her developer crew nodded and searched half her sentences under the table. At one point, I heard her say that the backend was basically plug and play, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper. The backend was custom architected across 5 languages and 3 microservice clusters, all of which I had duct-taped into harmony by sheer force of will and caffeine. Plug and play, my ass. Late one afternoon, I sat at my desk, the same desk just now wedged behind a concrete pillar next to the recycling bin, and cracked open the hard copy of my original consulting agreement. It was signed back when the company was just me, the founder Ronald, and a rented server rack in Cincinnati. I had insisted on using my own lawyer, my own licensing language, and retaining full ownership of anything I brought in. Clause 14b stated that all proprietary components were retained under Vance Intellectual Property Holdings LLC unless expressly transferred in writing. I had not transferred anything. There it was, in black ink, my name, their oversight, and my parachute. And Chloe was too busy filming short videos for social media in the stairwell to read the fine print. She thought that because I was quiet and knitted socks, I was just another old employee who could be phased out without a second thought. She did not know the history of the code she was deploying. The concrete pillar blocking the view of my desk became my shield, allowing me to work in peace without having to endure the constant parade of marketing staff and design consultants who frequented Chloe's office. I spent those long, quiet hours cataloging system dependencies and mapping out the data flows, creating a detailed reference document that would eventually serve as my roadmap for recovery. I was not angry, I was focused. I thought back to the winter of 2018. I was snowed in, broke, running my own consulting firm out of a studio apartment with a space heater that sounded like a dying goat. I built that first database algorithm on a borrowed computer with a busted hinge. I slept 3 hours a night and survived on boxed mac and cheese. When they offered me a full-time gig, I kept the patents where they belonged, under my name. I was loyal, but I was not stupid. I knew that in the technology industry, intellectual property was the only real currency that mattered. Founders could sell the company, boards could restructure, and new directors could fire the entire engineering team on a whim. But the owner of the patents always retained the ultimate leverage. I made sure my contract reflected that reality. So, when Human Resources asked me to sign off on some transition paperwork, I read every single line. One clause asked me to reaffirm non-ownership of platform components. I crossed it out with a red marker, and added a note stating that the intellectual property exclusion was retained as per Clause 14B of the original contract. I signed it and smiled. They thought they were sidelining me, but all they really did was take the training wheels off my revenge. It happened on a Tuesday. I was eating a piece of stale biscotti at my desk watching the build logs. That was when the notification pinged. Chloe had meant to direct message her new product lead, Preston Ward. Instead, she dropped the message in the main engineering channel. All 35 engineers got it. It read, "Honestly, we need to purge the legacy dead weight. Gavin is still here. Why? The period at the end really sold it. Cold, clinical, the kind of sentence you write when you think people like me do not read anymore or matter." You could hear the oxygen leave the room. One developer sent a confused face. Another quietly left the channel. Wyatt Brooks, the only developer with a spine, messaged me privately. "I am so sorry, Gavin. That was completely messed up." I replied with a thumbs-up emoji and finished my biscotti. 50 minutes later, Human Resources sent me a message saying they would like to touch base. I closed my laptop and prepared for the meeting, knowing the gears were finally turning in my favor. I met Human Resources in the glass fishbowl they called a wellness room, which always smelled like cucumber and compromise. Brenda Foley from People Operations sat there with her standard sympathetic face, clutching a manila folder. She offered me tea. I declined. "We would like to offer you a transition package," she said, sliding the papers across the table. It was 12 weeks of severance, and of course they wanted me to exit gracefully, maybe even write a positive recommendation. I almost laughed. They wanted me out, but kindly and neatly, like I was a stain on a white couch they could blot out with polite napkins. "Of course," I said, smiling. "No need to make this difficult." Brenda looked relieved. The legal document was written in a 10-point font. I read through the paragraphs, and then I saw it. Clause 7 stated that the employee relinquishes all claims to intellectual property associated with the platform. Brenda pointed at the line with her manicured finger, offering a rehearsed explanation about standard company policy and clean transitions. I listened in silence, watching the tiny dust motes float in the afternoon light. I knew that Human Resources existed to protect the corporation, not the individual, and this document was their final attempt to strip away my leverage. I clicked my pen, drew a single clean line through the sentence, and wrote in tight cursive, "Intellectual property exclusion retained as per original consulting contract clause 14B. I initialed it and slid the paper back. Brenda blinked and said she would have to run that by the legal department. I told her to please do so, and that I was happy to wait. I left the room before she could stammer anything else. I did not need her approval. I had the contract. That afternoon I packed up my desk. I took my favorite mug, a worn notebook with sketches from my first database draft, and the knitting needles Chloe had mocked. I tucked them all into a canvas bag like relics from a war no one else knew had already ended. No goodbyes, no farewell lunch, just a hallway of averted eyes and whispered messages. They thought I was done, but I was not retreating. I was removing myself from the blast radius. I loaded my boxes into my car and drove home, choosing the scenic route along the shoreline. The gray waves crashed against the stone breakwater, and the cool wind filled the car. I did not feel angry. I felt incredibly light, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in 8 years, I was not responsible for the stability of their servers. I was a free man with a solid contract and a plan. I spent the rest of the day sitting on my porch, enjoying the quiet and watching the wind rustle through the trees, completely disconnected from the corporate chaos I had left behind. By Friday, I was completely gone. My accounts were deactivated, my name was removed from the directory, and only a polite farewell email remained. At first, they celebrated. I could practically hear the espresso machine humming in harmony with Chloe's triumphant mood. She wore even higher heels, clicking through meetings like she was auditioning for a venture capital panel. They thought I had taken my knitting and gone into retirement. They thought the old man was finally out of the way, and that the new era of high-speed development could begin without any legacy friction. Then came Monday. Wyatt Brooks texted me privately. "Do you know where the deployment configuration files went? The pipelines are failing at the container registry." I did not respond. I had no reason to do so. The answer was buried deep in a private repository that only I could access. But it was not just the configuration. The architecture itself was behaving like a haunted house. Systems looped back into themselves like a snake swallowing its own tail. Every time they tried to compile a new staging build, the database connection timed out, unable to locate the necessary modules. The online messaging channels were flooded with messages from frustrated developers, trying to locate the deployment credentials. They tried to bypass the security layers, but the system was designed to automatically lock down when unauthorized attempts were made, requiring my private cryptographic signature to unlock. It was a digital fortress, and I had taken the keys with me. A new hire named Cody Miller tried to comment on one of my service files, asking what the word Cronug meant. Cronug was an internal joke from 2019 between me and a developer named Silas, who now sells surfboards in Oregon. It triggered a 4 in the morning cron job that handled rollback failovers during server crashes. Without it, their deployments were now sprinting face-first into a digital wall. Chloe, of course, refused to panic. She doubled down, ordering the team to bring in outside help. She snapped during a team call, wearing a leather jacket that made her look like an angry flight attendant. She claimed that offshore contractors could clean this up in 2 weeks. So, they brought them in, teams from Romania and Hyderabad. Smart people, skilled people, staring blankly at my database codebase like it was ancient Sumerian carved in lava rock. Wyatt told me later that one of the contractors quit mid-Zoom call, muttering about American tech ego and impossible spaghetti. Still, Chloe pressed on, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. They picked a hard launch date for the new platform, June 1st. No beta, no soft rollout, just one big public demonstration to impress the investors. Meanwhile, inside the development team, panic set in. Authentication started failing in the staging environment. The automatic server scaling stopped working entirely. Payment logs triggered recursive errors that sent alerts to the founder's cell phone at 2 in the morning. The developers were working 80 hours a week, trying to untangle the system dependencies, but every change they made seemed to break 3 other components. They were running on caffeine and panic, trying to rewrite the event handling protocols. But the modules were too tightly bound. Every time they attempted to swap out my proprietary caching layer, the database queries backed up, causing the memory usage to spike until the virtual servers crashed under the load. It was like trying to replace the foundation of a building while the upper floors were still being built. And then came the question. In a development meeting, the new product lead, Preston Ward, asked where the pipeline schema was hidden. A long pause followed. Then Wyatt Brooks spoke up. It was in Gavin's private repository. The room went silent. Chloe blinked and demanded to know the location of the private repository. They all looked at each other like kids who realized the babysitter had left hours ago and the stove was on fire. The repository was not on the company's shared account. It was hosted on a secure private server that mirrored to my holding company's infrastructure weekly. The same server with the contractually protected code modules. The same server Chloe never inspected because she assumed everything I ever built belonged to my firm. But here is the thing about building systems yourself from the ground up. While everyone else is pitching slides and chasing funding rounds, you remember where you buried the bones. And Chloe did not even bring a shovel. Wyatt was the only one pulling threads. He was digging quietly at night, between deployment failures and Chloe's daily messages about trusting the journey. And that was when he found the dependency tree. He opened the file path and froze. The database modules were not just legacy helpers. They were the spine of the system, the application programming interface throttle, the caching layer, and the event handler that allowed asynchronous task batching during high traffic cycles. My stack, the Vance Intellectual Property Stack version 4.2. My baby, Wyatt called Chloe into the code review thread, flagging the dependency. He pointed out that the platform was still pulling from the Vance proprietary modules and asked if they should clarify the licensing agreement. Chloe replied 3 minutes later with a shrug emoji. "Just comment it out," she wrote, as if you could comment out a nervous system. Wyatt did not comment it out. Instead, he quietly forked the code and downloaded the full dependency list. Every import, every hidden call, Every nested class that whispered my name in the system logs was documented. He knew that commenting it out would cause the entire platform to crash under any real user load. He tried to explain this to Chloe, but she waved him off, stating that they did not have time for technical debates. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking tea and watching the database logs roll in. I had set up a simple monitoring script 2 weeks prior. Every time one of my modules was pinged by an external network address, it logged the hit and queued a billing entry. It did not block the request. That would have been too obvious. It just listened and counted. One ping became 10. 10 became thousands. The staging builds, the development environment, and the demo sandbox Chloe used to show off to investors were all running on my proprietary code. They were using my intellectual property to validate their builds, run their tests, and demonstrate their progress to the venture capitalists who were funding their operations. Every time a script executed, it was a direct violation of our licensing terms, documented and timestamped in my secure logs. On May 14th at 2:04 in the morning, I uploaded a batch of PDF documents to the United States Copyright Office portal. The files contained the full codebase of the Vance stack, version 4.2, with every class, function, and database query annotated. The registration process was straightforward but thorough, requiring me to verify that the code was entirely my own work, created before my full-time employment began. The registration went live on May 17th under public record Vance Intellectual Property Holdings LLC, establishing a clear federal record of my ownership that no corporate legal team could dispute. The billing statements did not fire all at once. They began silently. An email was sent to accounting from my holding company, Vance Intellectual Property Holdings. The subject line read, "Second Quarter License Usage Report." Attached was a detailed spreadsheet with request counts, timestamps, and usage subtotals. It was not threatening, it was just a statement. Legal had not seen it yet, and Chloe had not either. They were too busy printing banners for the launch event. They had rented a co-working space downtown, setting up lights and banners featuring buzzwords they could not define. But Wyatt knew what was coming. He sent me one final private message. "You planned this, did you not?" I did not respond. I was busy adding a new field to the payment template. Retroactive per-seat licensing. Launch day arrived wrapped in glossy delusion. The live stream kicked off at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. Chloe strutted onto the stage in white sneakers and a cropped blazer radiating tech messiah energy. Behind her, a giant screen flashed the tagline, "Meet the Future," an adaptive database backend redesigned from the ground up. It was a funny choice of words, considering the ground was still mine. The demonstration worked, mostly. There was a little lag and one minor user interface glitch, but Chloe played it off like a professional. Investors clapped in the chat room. The founder, Ronald, looked proud. At 41 minutes past 10 o'clock, the first domino fell. A message hit the accounting inbox containing the invoice for the first quarter usage from Vance Intellectual Property Holdings. The total due was $245,800, with a due date in 7 days. Chloe did not see it. The receptionist flagged it as spam, thinking it was just another vendor request. But 40 minutes later, the director of legal, Grant Fletcher, saw the follow-up email that had been escalated to the executive queue. Grant was a conservative legal mind who had spent years handling contract disputes, and he immediately recognized the danger. He printed out the consulting agreement, compared it with the invoice details, and realized that my claims were entirely valid. He forwarded it to Chloe and the chief financial officer with a red flag. "This looks enforceable," he wrote. "We need to talk immediately." Chloe replied to ignore it, claiming they had moved off that legacy code, except they had not. At 7 minutes past 12, Wyatt Brooks replied to the entire thread with screenshots of the active codebase showing calls to the Vance proprietary modules, alongside logs from the live launch demo. "We are running on unlicensed code," Wyatt wrote. "This invoice is real." That was when the panic truly began. The chief financial officer immediately halted all marketing payments and called an emergency meeting with the accounting staff, while the development team tried to find a way to redirect the API calls. But there was no easy redirect. Every core transaction had to pass through my caching layer, and trying to bypass it would require shutting down the entire platform for weeks of rewriting. Slack channels erupted, and accounting began querying engineering. Chloe locked herself in the conference room, pacing and biting her nails. Then Wyatt dropped the final blow in the leadership channel. He confirmed that the codebase had been registered with the United States Copyright Office on May 17th under the name Vance Intellectual Property Holdings, LLC. It was public record. Grant, the legal director, followed up at 53 minutes past 12. He pointed out that per the original contract, auto-renewals were subject to cancellation 30 days prior to use, and that I had sent a formal revocation notice that went ignored. He noted that the company had no legal right to deploy the platform on June 1st, and that continuing to run the live servers constituted willful copyright infringement, which carried significant statutory damages. The legal exposure was massive, and they had no defense. It was completely legal and enforceable. The chief financial officer was heard shouting from his office, demanding to know why they owed hundreds of thousands of dollars. The launch party fizzled out. The investors stopped replying to messages, and the champagne bottles remained closed. The next morning, the tech press began posting articles about a licensing disaster at the startup. By noon, the board of directors had called an emergency meeting. The founder, Ronald, looked pale, and the chief financial officer was furious. Grant Fletcher slid the consulting agreement across the table, pointing to Clause 14b. The board did not yell. They sat in cold, horrified silence. They played a video Chloe had posted on her social media, where she laughed about how I did nothing but knit and how they had rebuilt everything. She had not rebuilt anything. She had just changed the layout. The founder looked at her and asked for her formal resignation, effective immediately. She stood up, silent for the first time, and walked out. The door clicked shut. Her entire team of assistants and designers packed their matching bags and left shortly after, leaving the office quieter than it had been in months. Later that afternoon, my inbox pinged with a message from the board asking to renegotiate the licensing terms. I did not reply. Instead, I sipped a glass of wine under a wooden pergola in a quiet vineyard north of Florence. My laptop hummed softly, and a stray cat dozed near my sandals. I logged into my billing portal and enabled per-seat pricing. Under this new structure, their fees would now accumulate at a rate of $50,000 a day. The per-seat licensing terms were non-negotiable, and any attempt to run the platform without paying would result in an automatic injection of security alerts to the hosting provider. I closed my laptop, took a sip of the rich red wine, and picked up my knitting needles. The bamboo clicked softly in the evening breeze, a quiet rhythm of victory. They had underestimated the man with the needles, and now they were paying the price, one seat at a time. The sun dipped below the Tuscan hills, casting long shadows across the valley, and I smiled as I started another row of stitches, enjoying the quiet sound of clicking bamboo.